Our next speaker is Eric Fleischer, or T. Fleischer as he's more commonly known, and we have his talk titled as Compost Tea Time, but he will talk actually about a lot more than compost tea. Compost tea is a method that's been developed of inoculating soil with microorganisms, and it's quite remarkable. But he will also address making compost and other topics and managing urban soil. I also wanted to mention there was a question in the first Q&A about phytoremediation and addressing toxic content in urban soils and how to grow things when you've got hydrocarbons or heavy metals and so forth. And there are landscaping methods such as swales and methods of phytoremediation that we can get into in this session as well. And also biochar, it can be a very valuable tool for adsorbing toxics in soil. But go ahead. Thank you, T.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, that comes up. I've been the director of horticulture for Battery Park City Parks for the past 25 years, and I'm the developer of organic landscape practices here at Harvard with the Facilities Management Operation Group, and I've been working with them since 2008 here. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about the challenges, and I think this ties really well into what Tom was talking about in terms of taking up the nitrogen. I'm going to talk a little bit about the players that actually are taking up that nitrogen. And of course, in agriculture, we're looking at a lot of bacterially dominated plants. So therefore, that bacteria, of course, takes up that nitrogen. And that was very similar to the situation we found here at Harvard. And by correcting that and balancing that biology in the soil. So I'll be talking a bit about that, but I'll also say where I'm coming from in Battery Park City a little bit, so give you a sense of a few different urban projects. I think what we're dealing with in an urban and suburban environment are basically ecologically disturbed sites, which we need to really put some balance into. And what this is really, it's a process as opposed to product-based system. Tom alluded to Scott's, and of course that's a product. There's also a lot of products available in the organic industry. And what's more important is to look at what is the process and how are those products useful within the process other than the products themselves. So this is Battery Park City. It's a 92-acre development, and you can see that all the areas here in green are the 32 acres that comprise the city, and this is where I've really developed this program. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, good. And there are a lot of different landscapes, obviously open fields. The one thing is they're very highly utilized, so as is the campus here at Harvard. A lot of different, this is the Irish Hunger Memorial that evokes a little bit of Ireland, and we have this bucolic landscape of Lyndon Miller's perennial gardens, typical urban landscape. Now, there are areas, we talked about lawns, and of course, a lot of us don't like the use of lawns, but there are areas where it does make sense, particularly in public areas where you need open space and people need to utilize it. The key is how do we manage public spaces and lawns responsibly so we get that root growth and we do sequester that carbon and pick the right diverse cultivars of lawn. Now we've dealt with our challenges in New York City and particularly Battery Park City, this bucolic landscape. Of course, we dealt with the after effects of 9/11 and rebuilding those soils after that. A few years later, we had a jet go down in the river, and it, of course, ended up lodged underneath our esplanade and tied off to my Betula nigra. You know? They didn't tie it off to something solid, tied it off to my tree. But the biggest challenge we have here and all of the urban landscapes that we deal with is the public. We have a huge visitation, and that's really what we're dealing with in terms of compaction, all those issues, and rebuilding that, breaking through those compaction layers in a way we can't do mechanically, but we can do it biologically if we know what we're doing. So I call this adaptive leadership in organic lawn care, organic management, not lawn care. So what is an adaptive challenge? And that is something that requires philosophical and behavioral change that puts us at our forefront of capabilities. And it can't always be solved by a technical solution, and what I mean by that is something that we have already all the answers to. We sometimes have to see what is the root of the problem and how are we going to fix this in a sustainable manner. Do any of you know who this gentleman is? Fritz Haber. Yes, okay. A great mind came up with a great discovery of synthesizing nitrogen, and he in fact got the Nobel Prize in 1918 for this discovery. And it's quite significant, the discovery of NPK, but it was never really questioned as to what that does and how that affects the other micronutrients and macronutrients in the soil. We're only dealing with 3 of them. So that brings me to a more thoughtful approach. We have come down this road in which we make decisions without really thinking about what data we've collected and what we're looking at and how we make those decisions as what we're putting into the soil, whether they be chemical or organic. So a sound horticultural practice that's based on process, soil management, testing and diagnostics, taking the right samples and looking at what the information that you have before making a decision. Obviously composting, which is a helpful, useful tool in developing and encouraging the natural nutrient cycling system. This is also a tool which can be useful with compost teas. Compost teas are a very, very small component on that, but it's something that people have tended to focus on. But it is a useful tool if used properly, and again checked that you're really getting the right growth of materials that you're trying to put through in this additive, or liquid biological amendment is how I prefer to refer to it as. Soil structure is a key component. You know, what is your air component? We kind of forget when looking at all the biology that we still need a soil medium which has, let's say, 50% solids and 50% room for air and water. No matter how we're looking at it, we need that. And when you have an understanding of what your textural gradation is, if you have more silt and clay in your soil, you will still have 50% space for air and water. However, you have a soil that's much more fragile and susceptible to compaction. And when it's compacted, then you lose that capability of it functioning as a growing medium. So we need to have that into account when we're dealing with our landscapes. What is that textural gradation? And then make your decisions accordingly. So if we look at the root zone, a subsoil base component, lower root zone, upper root zone, that's generally how we're looking at, you know, a natural soil is functioning. Mostly the organic material of the soil is really only in the top 3 or 4 inches where you have the really, really functioning soil medium. And in a really healthy soil, you're going to have real diversity. And I know Tom mentioned the issue with nematodes, and yes, there are root-feeding nematodes. Most of them survive wonderfully in compacted soils. But there are any number of nematodes that are extremely beneficial that we want to, in fact, have in our soils. This is one of them. This is a bacterial-feeding nematode. And this has a good diverse soil. Here you have protozoans swimming through here. You'll see these are flagellates that feed on bacteria. That's a ciliate. This is a ciliate. These are the protozoans that actually feed on bacteria. And that creates that nutrient cycling capacity. And that's what you want to see. This is a leaf surface where we have bacteria and saprophytic fungi breaking down that leaf. So you're sequestering nitrogen in this system in bacteria, but then you need to have your players. You need to have your predators. So this is not an ancient implement of torture. This is a nitrogen-feeding bacteria. And same here, this is a protozoan. This was a film clip, and I'm sorry, but it didn't transfer. But this is a ciliate. And again, this feeds on anaerobic bacteria. So this organism will turn around a landscape. If it is anaerobic, this will feed on anaerobic bacteria. Disease suppression. This is, again, fungi, beneficial fungi, which emits a pheromone, which lures in this root-feeding nematode and feeds on that. So the more diversity we have in our soils, that's what we're looking for. And that's what we're trying to encourage. And that nutrient cycling capacity. Compost is a perfect source for that. And again, we can do that in such a way, it should be an aerobic process. I should point out that this is 50 yards from the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. We do not have a lot of space in urban environments, but we can do this in a way that's not emitting odors that are unpleasant. We, in fact, have so little space that we do it indoors now in basically a glorified 15 cubic yard dumpster. And we put it into these bins, and we can bring that compost right to site to amend the soil as needed with those characteristics that we're looking for. But we do need to check what organisms are in that compost and what are in that soil and how it needs to be balanced. This is a very basic recipe. You can find that on the Harvard website. And so please find that if you, we have a table out here, and the website is on there so you can get that information. And we have a lot of information on this there. Compost tea was mentioned. Compost tea essentially is a liquid water, degassed, dechlorinated water, in which we're coaxing the beneficial organisms off a high-quality compost that has the biological properties that we want into the water solution. We then feed those organisms with foods such as humic acid, fish hydrolysate, kelp, molasses if we want to grow bacteria. Molasses, bacteria is obviously, sugar is a food for bacteria. But it's understanding what we're trying to grow in these teas and then monitoring that in fact we're getting that biology. The Harvard project initially started as a 1-acre test plot in Harvard Yard. I was here as a Loeb Fellow in 2007, 2008, and during that year talked about doing a test plot, which we started in 2008. And of course, you can see here we're taking, first of all, figuring out what's our textural gradation, and what are the both biological, textural, and chemical properties of these soils. We found, again, to have a very high bacterial content in the soil, and predators were non-existent, and the fungal presence and diversity really not there. So we focused on building up, obviously, liquid biological amendments that would bring those particular properties to the soil, and brought in compost that also would put those elements in the soil, as we did have a low organic percentage in these soils. So looking at that, we had a compaction layer 3 inches below the surface. And these were the initial, this was the initial test core that was done on March 10th. This was our control plot on May 2nd, and this was our test plot on May 2nd. And you can see the difference in root development. So you're definitely going to be sequestering nitrogen and carbon with this increased root development, whether it be lawn or any other crop that you're dealing with. But again, this had received no fertilizing. This had received its usual fertilizer applications. However, what we had there was an extreme amount of nitrogen availability tied up in bacteria. And by just bringing back those predators and the fungal presence, we increased that nutrient cycling capacity so that in fact we had 100 to 150 pounds of available nitrogen. So in the end, it really was really a very successful project, and here is our composting system now, as you saw earlier. A similar approach was taken at the Rose F. Kennedy Greenway. Their boxwood were suffering We were able to balance that biology in the soil to bring those boxwood hedges back. The turf conditions, again, were 2 to 3 inches of root growth, which we then developed to about 14 to 16 inches of root growth within 3 months. And this is within a turf area. Similarly, Brooklyn Bridge Park, which is a project I wrote soil specifications for, these trees were delivered to site. We could not plant them. So they sat within a makeshift nursery for 6 months, and we applied liquid biological amendments. And when we planted them, this is what went into the ground. So we really got great effects with this. This was an area, again, that with urban environments that we're dealing with. They'd had an ice skating rink on this property, and they took it off. We had to have it open for Little League by April 5th. We brewed a liquid biological amendment. It took about 5 days to brew this particular amendment. We applied it on March 22nd, and this was March 23rd. Now, people wonder, how could this possibly be? Well, in a sod that you've cut, all the roots are in that 1/2 to 1/4 inch of soil. We focused that application right to that area. This could wake up that biology in a way that no fertilizer ever could. So we do have the situation that we do have to survive, I think, with nature. And I love this picture because initially these ficus trees were growing on the temples, and when they uncovered these temples in Ackerwatt, their first response was to cut the tree down. Well, that wood contracted, and then the temple fell down. So it's a great example that we have to live side by side architecture with nature. And thank you very much.